Okay, the last time I read, Mr. Twit was coming up with a nasty idea. So, I can't wait to find out what this nasty idea is. The next chapter is called Mrs. Twit Goes Ballooning Up. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought! We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh, dear me, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit, and with a ghoulish grin on his lips he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvelous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone forever." Not a nice guy. Well, she went up, but the next chapter is Mrs. Twit Goes Ballooning Down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly, and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start to come down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. Each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climb slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly she began to float downward. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. She now began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary old woman in the sky. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see Mr. Twit. He doesn't look happy about it. Mr. Twit gets a horrid shock. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grisly old grunion! You rotten old turnip! You filthy old frumpet!" Mr. Twit jumped as though he'd been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer. He looked up. He gaped. He gasped. He gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. He said, "Oh." "I'll get you for this," shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down, right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to all the time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swash you to a swizzle. I'll gnash you to a nozzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with a stick and cracking him all over his body. Oh my goodness. Well, the house, the tree, and the monkey cage. But that's enough of that. We can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. We must get ahead with the story. Here's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and garden. Some house. It looks like a prison, and not a window anywhere. "Who wants windows?" Mr. Twit had said when they were building it. "Who wants every Tom, Dick, and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing?" It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out of, not for looking into. "And what do you think of that ghastly garden?" Oh boy, yes. Mrs. Twit was a gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. "I always grow plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles," she used to say. "They keep out nasty, nosy little children." Near the house you can see Mr. Twit's work shed. To one side there's the big dead tree. It never has any leaves on it because it's dead. And not far from the tree you can see the monkey cage. There are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit. You'll hear about them later. Oh, this is good. I remember this part. Hug tight sticky glue. Once a week, on Wednesdays, the Twits had bird pie for supper. Mr. Twit caught the birds and Mrs. Twit cooked them. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before Bird Pie Day, he would put up the ladder against the big dead tree and climb into the branches with a bucket of glue and a paintbrush. The glue he used was something called Hug-Tight, and it was stickier than any other glue in the world. He would paint it along the tops of all the branches and then go away. As the sun went down, birds would fly in from all around to roost for the night in the big dead tree. They didn't know, poor things, that the branches were all smeared with horrible Hug-Tight. The moment they landed on a branch, their feet stuck, and that was that. The next morning, which was Bird Pie Day, look at these birds' feet. Bird Pie Day, Mr. Tweet would climb up the ladder again and grab all the wretched birds that were stuck to the tree. It didn't matter what kind they were, song thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, crows, little jenny wrens, robins, anything. They all went into the pot for Wednesday's bird pie supper. Let me get this a little. By now you know the dings to ignore them, right? Four sticky little boys. On one Tuesday evening, after Mr. Twit had been up the ladder and smeared the tree with Hug-Tight, 4 little boys crept into the garden to look at the monkeys. They didn't care about the thistles and stinging nettles, not when there were monkeys to look at. After a while they got tired of looking at the monkeys, so they explored further into the garden and found the ladder leaning against the big dead tree. They decided to climb it just for fun. There's nothing wrong with that. The next morning, when Mr. Twit went out to collect the birds, he found 4 miserable little boys sitting in the tree, stuck as tight as could be by the seats of their pants to the branches. There were no birds because the presence of the boys had scared them away. Mr. Twit was furious. "As there are no birds for my pie tonight," he shouted, "then it'll have to be boys instead." He started to climb the ladder. "Boy pie might be better than bird pie," he went on, grinning horribly. "More meat, not so many tiny little bones." The boys were terrified. "He's going to boil us," cried one of them. "He'll stew us alive," wailed the second one. "He'll cook us with carrots," cried the third. But the 4th little boy, who had more sense than the others, whispered, "Listen, I've just got an idea. We're only stuck by the seats of our pants. So, quick, unbutton your pants and slip out of them and fall to the ground." Mr. Twit had reached the top of the ladder and was just about to make a grab for the nearest boy when they all suddenly tumbled out of the tree and ran for home with their naked bottoms winking at the sun. I guess that's where we will stop for today.